Now we would like to begin the session on metabolism of city and architecture. We will have two sessions. In the first half, we will invite three presenters who also have their works exhibited in the Future and Art session. We will start from Mihail, and then Aida-san, and then Fabio. Each presentation will be about 20 minutes. We have two architects, and they will be talking about digital fabrication and using IT computers to create new architectural works. And Aida-san is creating modern art. So he has very unique, imaginative concepts and making proposals to city development. And I think his works stand out because they're quite unique in the exhibition as well. So after the three presentations, in the second half, we invited the discussants who also participated in the pre-event workshops. And from the perspective of architecture or art or philosophy, we will have a broad range of discussions. It's not that we have ample time, so I'm not certain whether we can have sufficient time for a Q&A. But if time allows, we would love to take questions from the floor. So this is how we plan to proceed going forward. So let's kick off the presentation, starting from Mihail, please.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? No? Maybe yes or no? Yes, thank you. I am delighted to be here, both for the exhibition upstairs and today at this symposium. What does the future of the city, what does the future of architecture look like? In my work, I've been exploring the role of the computer in the design process, and I would argue that we're transitioning now from using the computer from what was once just about efficiency and control, and we are increasingly using it as a tool for exploration. We have a powerful tool at our disposal, and I argue that we should use it to enrich our environment, to create an architecture that is specific, heterogeneous, engaging, and one that elicits curiosity. I do not have urban designs or skyscrapers to show you. Instead, I have three very small projects that are personal explorations of nascent technologies in architecture. The first project that I will show is columns. It looks at how we can design a process that creates an object rather than creating the object itself. And for this, we need to figure out some process. It doesn't need to be complex. Even a simple process, if repeated often by the computer, can be surprisingly powerful. For instance, we can take a square and just divide it and divide it and divide it again into smaller and smaller parts. And if one shifts the midpoint of the division and repeats this, then perhaps already astounding designs appear that we could not have predicted. I'll go very briefly. We can bring this into 3 dimensions, and instead of using a square, we could, for instance, use a cube. And if we take the surfaces of the cube, the 6 surfaces, and divide them over and over and over again, and you go from 6 to 24 to hundreds of thousands, you end up with a cube that may look like this, or like this, or like this. The only thing that we're doing is changing the ratio of the division of the faces. They're all cubes. It's a minimal process, I would argue, because it has a simple input, a cube, and a simple operation dividing a surface. But arguably, it can lead to exuberant articulation of form. Can one apply this to architecture? I initially looked at columns. First of all, because they were practical in terms of their scale, but also because Greeks and the Romans had designed columns according to a very specific set of rules that they gave their artisans. They didn't provide drawings, but instead they said, take a column, divide it into different parts, expand it, and so on, much in the way that today we can give the computer instructions. So starting from a few cylinders, if one applies the same algorithm that I just showed, you come to forms that look perhaps like these. It's one process, and it can create many, many variants because we can run it again and again. And it can work at multiple scales, at the ground scale down to a very small detail. It's one single process that creates many permutations. And I usually argue that these are algorithmic artifacts. They are undrawable using conventional means. Of course, you could draw them with a pen and paper and a mouse, but it would take you a very, very long time. What these processes, as a matter of fact, have so much power that the question is, how does one really find a search mechanism to explore the space that is opened up? And then for me, it's about understanding the machine in a way as a laboratory, to experiment, to try out, in which one synthesizes and cultivates. It's about using the computer, and almost like the role of the architect changes almost to a cultivator, if you will, a curator. It's a composition via queries and clusters. It's a play of uncertainty. One forfeits control over exact attributes and gains control perhaps over broader attributes. How can one bring this into the world? 10 years ago, when this column was designed, 3D printing isn't what it is today. It was not as powerful. At that point, the only way we knew how to produce it was to slice it into very many forms. You're basically looking at an X-ray of this column and seeing the individual layers. And these were cut on a laser cutter. And what was very cumbersome work, but turned out like this, on display at ETH in Zurich. Quite similar to what was in the computer, 2,700 layers, 1 millimeter each. A view of the inside. It was possible to bring it out of the computer, but at that point it was incredibly labor intensive. It was exciting to see how people reacted. We put up no touch signs, but everybody touched them nonetheless, which in a way was nice, because I think that was just a way for people to comprehend these forms that they were confronted with. The gap between the virtual and the physical was huge. What took 35 seconds to calculate took 200 hours and an entire Christmas time to produce. And I swore to myself never to do it again. And then a few years ago, I got a call from this firm, and they had developed this machine. It's about 30 meters long. And it lifts up a piece of paper or a piece of cardboard, puts it on an assembly line, and cuts it at an incredible speed. It then strips out the parts that you don't like, and stacks them. So by the time that I go to drink a coffee or so, a column perhaps of this dimension is already produced. It is absolutely splendid, the speed at which it works. It's a laser cutter all the same, just a very, very fast one. With that, I decided to revisit the column topic one last time. And that is what you're looking at here. You'll notice that there are certain imprecisions because the material is working against us. It is simply too thin at this point. A second project, a grotto. This was done with a friend of mine, Benjamin Dillenberger, also at ETH. And it was a commission by a curator in France who thought that grottos embody an interplay between the natural and the man-made. And the premise was that these architectural processes which we're using today are also somewhere in between the foreign and the familiar, between the expected and the surprise, and the familiar, and between chaos and order, I would say. And they wanted us to create a grotto that was virtually produced, but then physically created, and that one could walk into. It started with this machine. It's a gigantic 3D printer in Germany. You get an idea of the size by looking at the door. And it prints 4 by 2 by 1 meter pieces at once, approximately 13 tons, of sandstone. There's 33 trillion decisions about whether a piece of sand gets vacuumed out at the end or whether it gets glued together and constitutes a form. And the interesting thing about this one is that there is no cost for complexity. So it doesn't matter if you print the simplest form possible or the most elaborate one you can think of, the cost is the same and the time is the same. There is no cost for customization. It's something we've been hearing with digital fabrication for a while. Whether you print the same form 100 times or individual forms, there's no difference in cost. And perhaps for architects, what's exciting is that there are no geometric constraints, or at least very few. We can create forms that wouldn't have been possible through milling or through a subtractive process. With that, we had a first proposal for a grotto, which looked like this, that one could walk into. The naive idea of what the surface quality could be. It was made of two parts because we weren't certain whether this new material would hold. And we divided it into very many bricks because although the printer could print a gigantic piece, very few places can exhibit or handle 13 tons at once. Then started a very fruitful time of what I call algorithmic play. It was this intuitive use of computers to design in 3 dimensions speculatively, not just about efficiency, not just about control. There was no need for functionality. Other than that, it did not collapse or so. It's a design uniquely in 3 dimensions, so there's no more plans and sections and elevations like in traditional graphical architectural design. It's a more sculptural approach. We're moving towards a fabrication without adaptation. We're not there yet, but I think at some point in the future we'll be able to press Control P and the 3D printer will simply print one of these forms. And much like with wood, there's the potential, and these are renderings here, of a fusion of structure and surface. So once again, the design intent was to be between natural and man-made, chaos and order, between the foreign and familiar, the expected and surprise. 2 sections, and then I will move very quickly to show you just how it is printed. I don't know if I can move forward. But it's essentially sand that is glued together into a form. It then gets excavated at some point. The loose sand gets vacuumed out, and the form emerges. You'll see this in 1 second. The form comes out in this dark brown. It's relatively weak. It needs to be coated and strengthened. The process is not without problems. It is the material is not UV resistant, it's not moisture resistant, the material science has not kept up with some of the other aspects of the technology. But it allowed us to create these bricks and to bring this form that we had in the computer outside. And what you're looking at here is also, it's the same process I showed earlier. It's a cube which has been divided again and again and again. And you're looking at the interior of this cube. The idea that we can create an architecture with a lot of information in it, that makes people curious, that people want to step inside and discover something new that they may not have seen from far away. The gap between the virtual and the physical, it's still there, but it's getting a bit faster. This was a follow-on project where we tried to increase the resolution and see what kind of potential there is for surface patterning. And we were quite happy with it until this happened right over here. A butterfly landed on it. It's not photoshopped. And then we realized we still had a very long way to go in terms of matching nature and what nature is capable of. In a follow-on project, we wanted to go back 1 step further and let the computer not only generate the form, but also evaluate the form. Because if it could generate and evaluate, it could learn. It could begin to optimize. So I mentioned that a computer can repeat a process many times to produce many variants. And we produced very many and had 20,000 visitors select between which of 2 forms they preferred to get some sort of a notion of which form is desirable or beautiful or interesting or worthwhile and which one is not. And we put it into a machine learning program. And it was impressive that the machine could, at the end, with 82% accuracy, see which form is preferable to the other one. However, the moment you gave it a form from outside of the training set or which was created with a different process, it was entirely useless. Instead, regression analysis helped us to identify two features that people like. We seem to like a depth complexity, and we seem to like an experienceability. And with that in mind, we let the computer just go ahead and evolve its own forms. So it's creating forms again and again and again from scratch. And at some point, it thinks that it can no longer optimize these. And at that point, we just said, stop. We will take this form. We will. We're not going to modify it any longer. And we took these forms and we simply stuck them together into Grotto and printed them. And that is what you're looking at right here. This was shown at Centre Pompidou a few years ago. And once again, it is a sand printing. These are details of the sand printing. 5 minutes to go. Can we make it larger? This was for a competition at PS1, which is a museum which has traditionally shown almost uniquely sustainable projects. And sustainability is important, but I think we cannot address only that. We have to also look at other, this technology has the potential for more, I would say. This was our proposal, a grotto for their courtyard. It's sort of a fountain of joy. A place with elephants and giraffes trotting about, and that people could enjoy in the summertime in New York, where it gets very hot, where perhaps performances could take place in the daytime or evening, made out of wood. And we lost the competition to a colleague who proposed a water purifier and won. That was a bit disillusioning. But we had the possibility, a Italian opera director, Romeo Castellucci, had seen this form and said, can we turn it into a stage for the Zauberflöte, the magic flute, an opera by Mozart? And we did. We produced it at a very large scale. It's 18 meters wide, 11 meters high, 9 meters deep. You can actually walk into it for the first time. It's created out of several pieces. People are up here, over here, so you can climb onto it. There's tunnels and so on. And these pieces come together during the opera. They assemble from different sides, and they can move around. They have integrated lights. They can tilt and shift, and so on. These are screenshots. And I will show you briefly an excerpt of it. Sorry, 3 minutes to go, yes. It's not synced with the singing, but you get some impression of it. Okay, I could listen to this all day, but I will advance. To the very last project, a MOOC, which should be a 3 in front of that, which I'm showing actually upstairs, a collaboration with 2 friends as well. And the inspiration for this was the architecture of the Islamic world, in particular of Iran. Muqarnars are elements that create a transition between a wall and a ceiling, or between a column and a beam, and they're very elaborate, meant to symbolize the heavens. They're often found in mosques. The world's expert on these is actually in Japan, Mr. Takahashi, who has cataloged every single Muqarnar, I think, in the world. It turns out this process that we've been using has the possibility to create such a form as well, simply by dividing iteratively again and again and again. And these processes are in the computer. We can use the same sort of learning of the computer to try to evaluate which ones are interesting, which ones are not. And they can be brought into 3 dimensions. With a detail, you can go in as far as you would like, almost. It turns out these are still tremendously difficult to produce. There are simply too many facets. The surface quality is of such a nature that the 3D printers these days cannot produce them at a large size, unfortunately. So what we resorted to was a simplification. we thought of the idea of perhaps instead of having individual modules, we would use tubes to create this geometry. So it's a sort of an abstraction. And what started out as hundreds of thousands of tubes had to be simplified further because our process, the process that we were using, was computationally designed, but the fabrication process could not keep up with it. It's robotically milled, but at the end of the day, the robot isn't able to create this level of detail yet. And I think we're at a point now where we have to not only design the design process, but also design the fabrication process. I think that's something that Fabio Gramazio, who's speaking later, is very likely to pick up. Here is the final form that was produced. It is upstairs right now. The idea that you can go inside and experience this space. And here some students who are a testament to the fact that it is not all robotic yet at this point. So to conclude, I think we're at a point where we need to understand the computer not only as a partner in design, but arguably as a muse. The computer can help inspire us. It can help us to be creative. I see the computer as a tool to draw the undrawable and to imagine the unimaginable, to celebrate the unforeseen. And I think in the long run, we stand to gain a richer, more heterogeneous, and more engaging environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to pose one question. In the slide, I have one question to you. One slide that left a strong impression was how to design and how to use new technology. I think that in spite of the short amount of time, you covered that very well. But in your slide, you said that many people would touch your work, even though it said don't touch. And I saw many people touching your works in the picture. And I felt that I wanted to touch your work upstairs as well. It's very decorative. And I think people just feel tempted to touch your work. And I think that's interesting. Because modern architecture tends to be very slick and smooth and not really tempt people to touch. But the work that you create, it's not really texture, but the shape itself has so many layers. And I think people wanted to just experience it. And you have created many works and exhibited them in many places. What are the new discoveries that you have gained in people's behavior around your works?
Yeah, well, the touch is, of course, I think a way that we as humans like to perceive, smell and scent being the other, and some of these forms stink very much. Whether it's the burnt laser cutter or some poisonous glue or something, so that is another way that people are unfortunately perceiving them, at least initially. But I think the real interesting thing of what you mentioned about the surface articulations or about this is that for the very first time it is no longer a luxury in the sense that it costs no more to create the smooth surface that you mentioned or the articulated form. And so for us, for a long time, it was the kings and the queens who had these elaborate forms because they were simply too costly to produce. Perhaps now there's the possibility of widening this, and it just takes some time until people are accustomed to the possibility of more surface or more articulations.
So in the past, only kings and queens could enjoy such a decorative surface, but many people can democratically enjoy it now. Thank you. Going on, and I would like to invite Mr. Makoto Aida. Good afternoon. My name is Aida. So I am known for these artworks. It's a bit ironical, not very sophisticated. That's my art. But I also do other things, which I would like to introduce to you today. And maybe not so popular amongst the viewers, but let me take up your time and introduce some of my works. So this is what I have exhibited in the Future and the Arts exhibit, like this. It's an architectural model. It may look a bit futuristic, but I have no idea what architecture is. I just imagined in my head that maybe a futuristic island would look like this. But the location is what I wanted to focus on. This is Kasumigaseki, which is the center of Japanese political ministries and agencies and so on. And this is an explanation which may be a bit more important. This is very cynical. So many people in Japan don't speak English. We are not very global or international compared to countries like Singapore and Hong Kong, where English-speaking countries colonized. So maybe Japan was never colonized and never had a need to learn another language, but maybe that's the irony of Japan, which left us in a state that's very inward-looking. I myself don't speak English at all, but this Dejima Island is a place where only people who speak English and who are global can enter. So I myself, although the creator, cannot enter this island. So perhaps the reason I was chosen to put my work in the exhibition was because this is an exhibition that I did last year called Ground No Plan. Obayashi is one of the largest general contractors in Japan, and the Obayashi Foundation asked artists to consider the issues faced by cities. So they provided the funding. And so I was the first artist that was chosen to do this exhibition with the topic of cities. So before that, actually I did several works toward that direction, perhaps. But I myself am an artist who is very ironic, who focus on ironic messages and many fake ideas and fake messages. And this is probably the first one in 2002. Very roughly speaking, this is land art. It's a huge art, I guess, Earth as the canvas. There were many works like this in 1960s, but it's my ironic take, cynical take on that. So I'm an artist, and I usually draw pictures on a small canvas, but sometimes artists' desires expand more and more, and sometimes artists want to go beyond these personal small canvas or even museums and create art that's so large that it cannot be contained in a building. So in a way, it's a self-reflection and antithesis to that. And perhaps artists should keep their art in a personal size. I myself am not good at computers at all. And I just draw pictures basically with paint. So
At the end of the day, what I just did was draw this picture. And I think at the end of the day, artists should be satisfied with art that is personal-sized. And this was actually before the previous one. There's a Shinjuku Gyoen National Park in Shinjuku. It's a larger, big park. And I lived in New York for a little while. And at that time, Central Park was quite close to where I stayed. And I really felt that the parks in Tokyo are nothing to compare against the Central Park. They're so small and insignificant. So I had a lot of time on my hands in New York, so I would take long walks in Central Park and imagine how Tokyo parks could be transformed. This is a plan of that. Like Joseph Beuys, I depicted these plans on the blackboard. It's pretty big. The love of nature in Japan and the cutting-edge urban technology, I guess these two were married, but the plan that I made is not realistic. Actually, good intentions and bad intentions are mixed together. Most of my ideas are like that. And the next one. And actually, all the pictures that I am showing you were exhibited in the Ground No Plan exhibition. This one, the ground shakes like an earthquake, and the obelisk is made with a very soft material. Obelisk was born in Egypt, but it's more of a Western architecture. I felt that it's symbolic of the Western architecture. So in Japan, prone to earthquakes, it's another cynical take on the shaking soft obelisk. And this one. There is the Tokyo Metropolitan Government building in Shinjuku. It was built when I was still a student, but as I watched it being constructed, the architect was Kenzo Tange, a famous architect. And I thought, not bad, but not interesting. I would create the Tokyo Metropolitan Government building like this. So those are my ideas. And it's very difficult to explain to foreign guests, but there used to be a large wooden bridge in Nihonbashi. It was a historic, important bridge for the history of Tokyo and Japan. But as Tokyo became more modernized, most of these historic wooden bridges disappeared. In order for the metropolitan highways to run above these bridges are now hidden under the metropolitan highways and in a shaded area. Maybe we can bring the bridge above the metropolitan highway. That's my idea. I'm not proposing this for real, but just an idea. And we have 5 more minutes? Really? Then this is another idea.
That's my idea. And this is a deluxe homeless house. It's very old. Well, next year, I'm going to build a huge size one, and I'm going to write a manga on that. The next page. This is the weeds for me. This is very old work. When I graduated from a college, art college, I had made this. There are another one with cockroach on it, and like weeds and cockroaches. I thought that that would reflect me. So I think this has to do with this present exhibition. And this is another thing. When thinking about a very difficult theme of thinking about cities and urbanization, I thought, how could I express myself? And I came up with this image. And next. And so for artists and architects, don't do anything, it says here. That's what the message I thought I should convey. And let's skip this. And maybe just you view it and just skip it. And I will come back later with this. Next, please. So, second floorism is this is not a real architect's activity. This is my conclusion. And what I thought about it, I just written on what I came to know and imagine through it. Earlier in the Architect Forum, they were saying that I think someone was saying very seriously that anybody can, it should be a future that anybody can make their own houses by themselves. And I think more technology for that is my message. And I don't know about this, so let's skip it. Well, this is just what I cannot express really. So I'm ashamed of this a bit, but I'm showing you. But you're laughing, and the earlier was as well. You're laughing. Well, this is a pillar made of carbon, very lightweight, and inside structure is open, but with a strength. Structure, and if we can come up with such a pillar, the situation would be changed. The image came into my mind, and if you use 3D printer and using computer, it may come up, but I don't have that technology, so I used a paper clay to make this. But maybe better if it's complex, but I think this is a maximum thing that I can make with my own hand. And this is, I often post my messages on Twitters and SNS, social networks. I think a human being became to use these technology, and I think since then the positioning of the artist have changed, and I think that itself is becoming a theme. And I had made a message, posted a message on the Twitter, and it just flamed up to the refugee of Syrians. I thought that I had expressed one just paragraph, maybe 2 sentences, saying that we should accept those Syrians in such a way in Japan. And then there was such a negative message to it. And of course, that was voice. This is Joseph Voice, and I pretend to become him. And in Japan, we have a singer called Sawada Kenji, and he is singing a song called Casablanca. I tried to have the poet of this on his songs. Artistic dandy. So in the society, what is the positioning of the artists? I often think about that. But artist myself is stupid, is the representative of foolishness. And 5 more minutes. And I think many of you living in this society is all fools, and you're not elegant. So the speakers on the stages and the panelists are excellent people. They have studied a lot, and they know very much about the things. And I think those people should lead the others. And that is basically the right thing. Ignorance. So the representing the fools, general public, I think coming into this Academy Hills and making presentation could happen sometimes, I thought. And I thought that I was such a representative, representing the general public. And I'm the only one who is, I think, representing the general public, the ignorance. So I'm showing you the video. Pretending, I think up to a certain a time in this Mori Art Museum, this video has been shown. This is a Japanese Prime Minister pretending a person and virtual and trying in non-fluent English, trying to come up with these messages. Sakoku of this is Neo Dejima is art that is exhibited myself. I think is corresponding to it. What I think is something similar to this message. But in the Edo period, Sakoku, where we had the closure of the country to other countries, we had Dejima, where foreigners were isolated and were forced to live. So international aspect and non-international aspect exists in Japan. I think all of the nations are having such a mixture of that. That's a different thing. And I think not just Japan. So maybe moving forward. In Vienna, Austria, I think under a social theme, there is an exhibition going on with social messages. And there were Twitters and in internet. People said that the earlier work that I mentioned to you was flaming, that they made a mistake, but to my work, saying that you are actually distrusting and making Japanese prime ministers less confident with what I've done with my artwork. And they said that they don't want this art to be exhibited in Vienna. And they said that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs should take that work out. And that has happened already with my work. So everybody on the internet said that shame for Japan. So that's it about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So let me ask one question.
In your artwork, you have Neo Dejima. Did you select that, or that was it selected by the museum? Yes, and Neo Dejima instantly is you have the criticizers on the internet. Neo Dejima, the top part of Neo Dejima is some sort of futuristic city. At a glance, it just was familiar with others. If you don't just read it in detail, you don't understand the message. And then people start saying, after reading message, what's this here? In this metabolism age, we have the artificial land high up in the I think Kasumigaseki is a wonder. So I think this is ironic as a land art, the Hito character. Then I think that's another dream, futuristic, ironic message for the future. Oh, thank you very much indeed then. Thank you.
続いて
Next, let me invite the third speaker, Mr. Fabio. Please start the presentation.
So thank you very much for inviting me here. I'll try now to show my ideas, my work, and probably relate to what Michael and Aida have put on the table as ideas and concepts. Probably the work with ideas will be a bit harder. Although I think that irony is a very, very important thing in not only in art but also in architecture. So what I would like to talk about is this concept here. Digital materiality in architecture is a word creation we are working with, we operate with since a long time now, where we try to suggest or to state that these two realms, so these two concepts, the digital on one side being related to the rational, to the precise, to the logic, and the materiality, which is a sensual category and experience that is part of the world, and as an architect is always the end manifestation of architecture, that these two things relate to each other more than we possibly think. So the question is, how can the digital be materialized? We've spent almost 20 years, the last 20, maybe 30 years, trying to digitalize everything, to abstract, to produce information. But for us architects now, the challenge is how to bring back this information into the world we can physically experience. So literally how to move from information to the material. And in order to do this, we need machines. And Michael have introduced technologies like 3D printer. When we started investigation, we thought that we should take this machine, the industrial robot, as being the expression of both the 20th century, so the automation of production, but also a machine that goes beyond this. Starting with the name it has, so the robot, it's a name that very much owns to fiction, to literature, to these things, and see what relationship it has with us humans. What you see here is an artist's image. It's not by us. This is not the way you use a robot. It's much more expressing what we truly believe, that we, so the human and this machine, are interlinked. And it's about this relation that I would like now to bring up an example, a very simple but powerful example that explains this. Here you see a brick wall. This is architecture in its maybe purest and simplest form. It's the addition of parts. So architecture is an additive art. It's about assemblies. Now, in order to design this, you need a notation, and this probably is the most intuitive, most direct notation. So we just draw what we will then later build, but this is very impractical. In reality, before digitalization or throughout history, we have created abstractions. So cultural conventions that allow us to communicate. There you see the bond type, the stretcher. This is a thing a mason understands. So once you have this and define the brick and the outer dimension of what you want to do, everything is set, everything is clear. You don't need more information than this. So it's extremely compact and efficient. Now, in the digital domain, if we work with machines designing, then this translates into this very simple algorithm. So just two nested loops that do exactly the same. We just distribute these bricks along a surface. Now, this is interesting and powerful. Not this, because this does just the same. But if I add a few lines at the end of this algorithm just by telling the bricks to rotate, then I do something that at first sight looks banal, but is extremely powerful. Because now, what could before be just communicated with stretcher bonds, a term defining a process, now translate into this on the right. This is an angle and a position is on space different for each single brick. So it's a thing that I cannot understand anymore, that I cannot read anymore, and talking about the right side of the image, and I cannot execute anymore efficiently. But now it happens that the machine loves these numbers. The machine doesn't understand anything. It's not intelligent, and at least the machine we use, but understands this number and doesn't distinguish between easy to relate position in space and complex. So it shows that the machine is completely different from us. And if you understand this difference and think it in a complementary way, not in a competitive way, as it has been, built up by 250 years of industrial revolution and the Marxist rhetorics of the opposition between the machine, the capital, and the human, then we can directly connect this activity act that is deeply human of designing some things, of defining logic, defining processes, and its execution and right, and end up with something like this, which is now deeply material, deeply sensual, at the same time the expression of something that cannot be done without digital logics and machines executing these digital logics. I would like to browse through one project. This has been a seminal project for us where we applied these thoughts and technologies to architecture. Here you see the production of data. It's a winery. The brief was to create a facade for this winery. So we had to develop a design strategy in order to produce the data for all this tens of thousands of bricks. So we filled a basket, a virtual basket with spheres, grapes, and then looked at it from the facades and translated this visual information into rotations. Something abstract in something very physical, so the reflection of light on bricks, physical material elements. And here you see the other side. This is the machinic side of the process. Here is the machine executing extremely complex yet banal for the machine steps. And then, and here I relate to what Michael was showing, placing these elements in space, 3D printing this thing. At the level of complexity that is very high, not executable for humans, but still very, very low resolution compared with he was showing us. And then these things were brought to the building site and placed. Here you see the result, just a few images. See, it's a very, very sensual things that works with the basics of architecture, which are light, space, reflection, contrast, and so on and so forth. Second example, it's a bit more complex, sophisticated. This is the roof, 2,300 square meter, and this is structural. It's not a fill-in like in the winery. Here you see the only plan that exists of this roof. Other plans do not exist because they are meaningless. They're too complex. This is an interesting thing because it shows how ductile this design becomes. Not when it's built, but in a design phase, you have 50,000 elements that, and here you see a short movie of the production process where a machine picks a slat 5 by 10 centimeters, very basic product, industrial product, more or less as it comes from the industry, from the wood, so no gluing, nothing. And then cuts the ends and places it on a gigantic bed and stacks it in layers and produces huge 15-meter long trusses that then are prefabricated elements that get transported to the building site and installed. And the fascinating thing here is that we start with 50 low grade, I would define them, 50,000 elements, and imagine 50,000 elements on a pile, all different, and reduce this complexity throughout this project and the digital design process to just 168 parts. Highly complex part like this, that can then get installed in a very, very simple, just by placing them, putting a few screws on the building site. And you end up having an architecture, I have to move on, that looks like this, where things come together. It's just one material, one process, but it's the structural layer, it's the static layer, it's the space where all the subsystems get pre-installed, sprinklers and so on. Here you see what the precondition is. This is an abstraction, but it's the computational models and all its different states overlaid that you need to control such a design. So you do not design the final form anymore, but you design a logic and a process that allows you, and I go back to this flexibility, fabric-like flexibility of the first plan, that allows you to be open to change until the last minute before production. You have a duct that has to go through, then you don't cut out something, then you just stretch the structure in order to the duct to be accommodated. And here you see the complexity behind it. So it's 50,000 elements and 1 million nails. And because the connection is always different, also the position of these nails has to be different. This is a thing you cannot draw. This is you can only calculate, and you need this in order to be able to iterate through it and to mediate this problem with the structural engineers on the project. Now I move to, these were two architectural projects, a very pragmatic, very clear, simple. Now I move to speculation with one project that radically questions sustainability or engages with sustainability in architecture. It's called Rockprint. It's an installation for the first Architectural Biennale in Chicago, 2015. It leverages on the physical principle of jamming and the jamming transition, which is depicted here, that says that if you take rigid bodies and constrain them in a space by applying boundary conditions or a force, you can turn liquid material into solid. And if you take away these constraints, the material transits into its liquid state again. This is a thing that can be experienced by everybody at breakfast. This is cornflakes. Are excellent. Of course, with spheres, this doesn't work. It's very depending on the geometry of the particles. And here you see what we did. So we used a string to jam gravel by layering it with a robot. So this is the information part of the whole thing by using a very common string. The robot would create patterns in layers. Then we would put the layer of gravel and then repeat this process until we would have reached the whole height of the exhibition of the piece. What we did here basically is to integrate the information inside the material by leveraging on the machine. So it's a sort of a slow, tedious, again, 3D printing-like mechanism where the string acts as the glue, because with the weight of the layers, it creates friction between these parts, and it allows certain parts of these physical volumes to stick together. Here you see the demolding process. You see, because of the weight, the jamming mechanism is already in place, but now we brush away the material that is not held back by the string and reveal this interior column, where you see the design is informed in a way that the weight is at the top, putting as much load onto this legs. Here you see the details view, and here you see this is the most important aspect. This was the finissage, so the last day of the exhibition. We had to bring away our piece. Of course, you cannot take it away in one piece because it doesn't hold together, but you can rewind the string like a movie, you know, and you end up with the pure materials you started with. So a string roll on the right and just a pile of material. Yeah. 5 minutes to go, fine. So I moved to the last project, and this is the project on show here. It's called Flight Assemble Architecture. It's a pretty old work. It's 2011. We did this together with a good friend and colleague of ETH, a control specialist working with drones. And this inspired us because the idea of sort of neutralizing gravity of flying is a thing that comes back from time to time in architecture. Here you see Instant City by Archigram. And also the idea of thinking architecture as the stacking at several sizes and resolutions of elements is a thing that in last century, thinking of the metabolists, structuralists, here you have Habitat 67 by Moshti Safdie, or very pragmatically this has been done here with Kurokawa in Tokyo, again, end of the 60s, could now be thought of, no, I'm not talking about realized, by speculating on flying machines that with the same logic we have seen now with the brick wall would operate at a complete different scale. What you see here is a machine holding a whole building. You know, this is a 3-story block, and with this we designed a vertical village, the structure being 600 meter tall, for 30,000 people. We created a whole story around it. This was commissioned by the Frac Centre in France. So we went to France and looked for a place where we could put this speculative architecture. This is a TGV station. This is the high-speed French trains that has been built middle in nowhere for political reasons, Meuse. So we said, nice, we will build this tower on top of this station, so connect this village to Paris in less than an hour. Here you see all the drawings, the plans. Here you see visualization of this structure. And we have went through, you know, in a very classical manner. So ideal city planning has a long tradition. Starts with in the Renaissance. It has every few centuries you have intensities coming up of architects speculating on a possible future. And here maybe I can relate to Aida's work. This was not meant, it has never meant to be built, you know. It has also an ironic side. These things had always such a side to this. They were described in detail. You know, it was about the technical details, also about the social models these things would inspire. So we have sort of copied this technique, you know, trying to evocate almost a reality, although there is no, I mean, it's completely fictional. The machine, the size, the resolution, all these things do not exist. Now you see the images. We draw factions, we distributed programs, we calculated, you know, in this gigantic structure, how much time you would need to go from A to B, and how this 3 stories block could be composed, you know, accommodating for very, very different programs. And then in the exhibition space, and this was the whole point of the thing, you know, we just opposed this 1 to 100 model to this project, you know, but not just as a model, but as a model built in space, in the exhibition space, during the exhibition. So relating to probably more to, you know, performance art tradition, you know, where you perform something. Really going into the details, looking at how this machine should work, thinking how the logic should be, planning extremely carefully the flight path of this machine that were completely autonomous. They didn't know anything about what they would do, but they were aware of the other machines in the space. And this you see in this very short movie. And flight assembly architecture for us has been, a chance to radically expand the scope of digital fabrication. To go beyond and to look into the future. Whereby this quadcopter that is, performing this thing in a very simple, natural way in space, at the same time questions reality and utopia, and questions this sharp, supposedly sharp boundary between these categories, where in the same space you have a completely speculative project relating to a certain tradition, and then it's not clear in the end, what is more real? Is it more real the technology that is already here that is performing this thing in a model, at the model scale, or the vision we depict on the other side, about the real thing that is absolutely not feasible yet? And with this, conflict, I would like, or this idea, that this thing can coexist, these two levels, I would like to finish my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So let me ask one question similar to the previous presenters. Can you hear me? One question? So ETH, Zurich, I visited Zurich last year, and I watched the robot art last year. And in the Venezia Biennale, I think there were exhibitions, and I understood very well your works. And there was one from the Chicago Biennale. When you remove the mold, the gravel starts to fall. So not everything is controlled. So maybe there is aspect of chance. So it's rather different from the other works that you have. And also there was one from the winery, very sensual expression with the facade. So you mostly talked about how your works are created, but what are the inspiration, or what are the aesthetics that I think that these new technology could open up?
I think this is a very good. I have to switch off this. A very good observation. The first two works I showed are very controlled. So these bricks are, although bricks are never identical, and also timber is a very complex material to work with. We'll know because it's a naturally grown material. But there it's about applying a level of control that allows you to anticipate how things will aggregate. And their work on jamming is sort of the opposite. And we have done other works like this that I didn't have the time to show, but we are convinced that looking into the aggregation behaviors of materials that have, an own behavior, assembly properties that can be controlled only to a certain extent is extremely interesting on the technological level, because now we start to have the means to control these things. When we started, this robot was just 6 motors that were able to address something in space. So there was no feedback control, there was no sensors. They had absolutely no perception or understanding of their environment. if we start to integrate feedback processes, where we look at what we have done or how something is aggregated in order to decide for the next steps, then we can start to work with much more complex material that probably are also, I would say, more sustainable, because for example, if something aggregates on its own, this can allows us to incredibly speed up the production process, because we don't have to place each singular element. And the jamming example very nicely showed that we can do without, the bonding agent in between that normally is then an obstacle for the complete and clean build back of architecture, so for urban mining. But now I didn't answer the question about the statics, maybe.
Thank you very much. We passed the time, but let's take a 5-minute break, a short 5-minute break, and we will restart in 5 minutes. Start the second session. Thank you.
So, can we start now? Yes. No, I think we have to wait until Fabio returns, and he needs to put the headset. And in the afternoon, we have until 4:45, and we have to be strict to the ending time. We don't have an hour yet, but we had 3 presentations already. And in the previous study group sessions, we had pre-meetings, and there are 5 participants who had participated in this, and they are going to engage in this discussion. And I would like to ask, first of all, them to say a few words how they felt about the presentation. And this is going to be in the order of from architect and going a bit further to the architect, into the urban planning and into the enforced agriculture. And I think the top speaker will be Mr. Obuse, or Professor Obuse. Yes, can you start? I'm sorry. So today, thank you very much for the very enthusiastic and very nice presentation. And I'm an expert of the architect, but I'm not at all an expert. So rather than being an expert, I came here 10 years ago to Japan, but before that I was doing work in London. So in the architect, I was rather manufacturing side of the business of the architecture. So my comment and my opinion, well, when you just say architect, it is covering a wide range of things. But one aspect of architecture, of definition or concept, could be that from outside, protect yourselves. You make wall and roof, and you make the interior. That is, I think, one role, one aspect of the architecture. And by doing so, that means you can protect yourself, and at the same time you would limit yourself. In Japan, I think architect, you would want to engage more with the nature. So, but in case of non-Japanese architects, I think you want to separate the exterior and interior. That's one of the major definition of architecture. But I think listening to the 3 presentations that was made, Aida-san, I think as well, you want to free yourself. You want to liberate. And you have the tool, or you have the algorithm. So you want to achieve what you cannot do. You have to select the tool or method or means, and you can go after freedom. Irony could be one aspect. So from the limitation of the society, you want to go outside of it. Maybe that's irony is one tool for you, Aida-san. But in the morning session, we heard that desire to freedom. What does it do with freedom? and desire. So in order to free yourself and in order to achieve your desire, how should I say? I think this is a humanity aspect. You want to do something, you want to achieve something. So by liberating yourself or wanting to do that, it may be a limitation. You have the tool, you can achieve it. But if you don't have the tool, you cannot do it. If you have the desire, you want something. But then I think in the capitalism, I think it was mentioned, it is something of an opposite thing. It may bond the life of a human being. So freedom and desire. From myself, there is some relationship. Maybe we can discuss on that as well. Yes, I think this way. So Toyoda-san, Mr. Toyoda, it may be similar to his presentation, but in the morning session I mentioned, and I think listening to Fabio and Michael, you're using digital tools, but I think you have a desire or a wish that you want to control something you are not able to control. For example, I'm from Ando Tadao Architect's office. And completely controlling architecture has been desired in the past. But I think there are uncontrollable things, vagueness, ambiguity. And I think indirectly you can, manage that. But I think that is far beyond the digital technology. So it is not 1 to 1. This is not numbers, not 0 or 1, but it should be a gradation or, so to speak, ambiguity that I think we want to see a work that is beyond that. And this is going to be very abstract. My name is Aiba, and let me be just direct, more visible. So urban designing and planning, I think we need to check whether what architects make is sustainable or stable, or it could be controlled. That's our eyesight. That's how we perceive. And today's title is Metabolism. Rejuvenate. Whether we can rejuvenate and metabolize in a good way is what I do and look after. In Japan, we have declining population and metabolism. So far, we had a good mechanism so far, but it is now at the turn of decline or at being collapsing. So we need a new metabolism, or we need a new system for sustainability. And that's what I'm interested in. So the three presentations that I heard gave us lots of tips, I believe. How I take it, interpret it, was that you have a very big bio ecosystem. And I think in a certain degree, we made some certain part an extreme growth, but not the others. It was not imbalanced. So the first one, 3D printer, you are making that and that's technology, and that's good. But Michael, what you want to express, what you had impressed was that maybe you wanted to go to the religious type of architecture. You want to be so confused, like so complex, and people can just touch it and admire it. I think that's one way of architecture, and that's how he had expanded an architecture. And I think Mr. Aida's presentation was talking about, I don't know whether I can express it in a good way, but through Twitter's directly communication, and you get a generation of the media or people's voices. And I think you are making one art out of it. Maybe Trump and the current Japanese politics are being generated. So you have just extremely gone to that end and made that art. In Fabio's presentation, my interpretation was that In Japan, for example, you have a worker at the very tiny shop, a craftsman. In the community, you have the workers and the builders. So the manufacturers' methods and mechanisms has gone to a certain extreme level. And so I think that was very interesting format to see, and how that is going to be combined in the future plan, and how can we stabilize that in the future cities is how I would perceive. And I don't have an answer to it, but I think that was a very interesting presentation. And in this discussion, I need to find out how it could be combined and what is the next ecosystem, next stability for a generation. I want to discuss on that point further. Thank you very much indeed.
Shinohara-san, please. My name is Shinohara. Is the microphone on? I really found the presentations interesting. I am not an architect. I study philosophy. But 3 years ago, in the Venezia Biennale, I was involved in the architecture exhibition, in the concept building and the presentation. So when I look at architecture, I am interested from the philosophical perspective. Especially Fabio's presentation I found to be very interesting. You said that digital materiality, and you talked about the relationship between the two. But one question that I had was when we talk about material, I think there's a kind of a non-human aspect that cannot be controlled by human beings. So in the Chicago exhibit, the object would collapse in part. And that kind of a contingency or aspect that cannot be controlled entirely by human beings is the materiality. And so we have to, perhaps you're looking, I'm not sure, but perhaps you're looking at materiality in that aspect, but also together with the digital aspect. And the reason I pose this question is because in Japan, and as in other parts of the world, natural disasters are a very important factor when we talk about architecture. And the Great East Japan earthquake on March 11th was a very big turning point. And the fragility, the vulnerability of the architecture and buildings, artificial buildings, was something that everybody looked at. And so that's the fragility of materials, and that's something that we have to also turn our attention to, perhaps. And Funabashi-san, I am probably the farthest to this topic. I work in the Sony Computer Science Research Institute, and I study food production, symbiotic agriculture. So this session is focused on cities. And whether it's metabolism or new materials or new technology, whatever the case, cities are an aggregation of human activities, and we tend to consume natural resources. No matter how efficient the energy usage is in Roppongi Hills, if there are hundreds of these buildings in New Delhi, then it's going to have an environmental burden. Maybe we don't need to use, maybe of course we can use renewable energy, but when we talk about biodiversity or the ecosystem supported by these various aspects of nature, when we look at this not from the nature conservation, but from the humanity's perspective, actually it is food production that is destroying nature. And so my research is how we can bring back and rebuild the environment from the aspect of food production. And my background is on biology and agriculture. So from that aspect, Mihail, you said that by defining the process, you can create very complex patterns. And actually, this is close to the role of genes in biology. Our body plan,
does not have the ultimate design plan. It is just that when this gene becomes effective in this time, then the head and the tail attributes are created. And then by the nose of the chemical substances, the spinal cord is developed, and then ultimately this very complex human body is formed. And if that is, and I found that your algorithm is very impressive. And in physics, it's called fractal. And I'm sure that you know these concepts. In my field, in the ecosystem, different living species create an environment that is where they can live in harmony while competing with one another. And this is also very similar. For example, we often talk about greening buildings. But from the perspective of ecologists, actually, it doesn't make any sense. Covering buildings with similar size forests or trees, it doesn't make sense. Actually, that's like Central Park. And natural forests are very different. There is a lot more variety or fluctuation in the size or types of trees, and that is created by the natural communication between the plants and the trees. So I think Mihail's methods is similar to the architecture in enabling the growth of various types of plants and trees. And if you can develop that kind of algorithm, I think that would be interesting. And Aida-san, I found your presentation very interesting as well. I think there is two types of intelligence. One is just the intellect, and the second is the ability to be able to do foolish things that nobody else can do. And one cannot exist in a vacuum. It needs to exist together. And you said that you are the representative of the foolish and the ignorant. But, for example, wild animals or beasts do something that looks very foolish to humans. And the reason why cows have tails is because dinosaurs used to have these very strong tails that could attack their opponents, but cows have lost that, and the cows can no longer beat the lions via their tails, but rather cows or gnus or zebras run ahead of the lions, and actually this allows the mechanism to clear the grass and have the rain seep in and be able to absorb the rain. So if the cows had, for example, guns, then they can battle lions, and so the fact that they have no protection against lions looks very stupid to us human beings, but actually what they do makes sense. So I was in Africa until last week, and I was chasing after cows. So actually there are different types of intelligence, and what may look foolish is actually smart if you look at the larger picture. And let me turn to Fabio. That was a very logical presentation, and I was very impressed. So what I thought was if everything could be completely turned into an algorithm and you could create those soft structures, at the same time, you also talked about something that's not completely controlled by humans, for example, autonomous drones, or maintaining the structure with these threads. And I think that perhaps you are redefining what it means to complete the construction of an architecture. There was a huge typhoon in summer, and we saw many buildings destroyed. But maybe that destruction process is part of the architecture design. For example, if a zebra's leg is eaten by the lion, then the zebra needs to continue to exist, and such zebra sometimes continues to exist for several years. And of course, lizards or amphibious animals can regenerate their body parts. So it changes from the original structure, but it can find a new equilibrium by this destruction. For example, the typhoon changed the layout of the house, but it's actually more convenient. So sometimes what could be destructive could bring benefits. And if that could convert, then I think that would be great. Thank you very much.
So we had a comment from each different fields, from 5 speakers. Our comments, our opinions. So from the order of the presentation, do you have anything that you want to comment or answer to the comments that was given by the 5 speakers? Or would you like to complement or supplement your presentation? So from the order of what we had started, can you start, Mihail?
Toyoda-san brought up the interesting point about control, and I think that's something that architects are very unhappy with. It's all about traditionally controlling every little aspect of a design and leaving nothing up to chance. But if we want to harness the powers that computers have, and in doing so mirror perhaps some natural processes, then we have to be willing to give up a bit of control of particular details to go to to get control of broader attributes. Towards what end? I think that's where desire comes in. I can only answer that personally. I always dream of simply a more heterogeneous environment, of a more engaging environment. It doesn't need to be necessarily a religious building. I would be very happy if this ceiling had more information in it, or if this ceiling would have something that I would want to look at in it. You brought up the inside and outside thing being a part of Japanese architecture, and in European architecture it's more about a division. I have to take a different position. I've been locked in this building for 2 weeks, and you cannot get a breath of fresh air in here. Whereas in Europe, you can open all the windows. It's a law, actually, that except for ETH. Yeah, interesting point. But and going to yours, I think we indeed are mirroring natural processes on some level. It is about there are parallels. We're working in families. We're crossing designs. You can think of it even as cultivating, as breeding new generations, new populations. I'm not sure the designs that I do are indeed fractal, because they're missing certain features, self-similarity, and so on. But there are definitely these parallels, and I think and they merit further discovery, and not just for the sake of creating something that is interesting to look at, but also for working at an urban scale. They could have urban applications, or even for fostering sustainable goals of sustainability. I'll leave it at that.
So next is Mr. Aida. Well, yes, the Grand No Plan, the exhibition that I did last year, you saw them. That is something about the internet. Architects and architect critics, I think, criticized me a lot. No, I didn't, I guess. Well, I think, I had assumed I would get those criticism, but architects was in the past, and the current architects, I think, thinking about awful things, and I may come up with a new idea, I thought, and they said that 20 years ago I knew it. So that was a really hard homework for me. The last year's exhibition was indeed. But I'm an artist, so because I'm an artist, I don't say that I have abundant images, abundant new ideas coming out. Well, I think an ordinary artist, you would assume that he is imaginative. But especially today's presentation, the architects, Mihail and Fabio, they are aesthetics. That means beauty, showing beauty. Architects, engineers, and when you go to the exhibition and see above, compared to what I make, they are beauties that may make. So what I make is not a beauty or aesthetics. I think position is right the opposite, I believe. So there is no conclusion from my comment. I'm sorry. Thank you.
I mean, your images are perhaps some of them are meant to be ironic or something. But if I look at, for instance, the Nihonbashi Bridge, I think it's actually a very rational and a very logical conclusion to the next step, rather than putting this highway underground, as is now planned. I would love to see this bridge built on top of it. So perhaps the gesture is ironic, but I think these ideas merit, to me, these ideas merit discussion.
Thank you.
Well, actually, yes, as was pointed out by Mihail, yes, the highway going underground. I think the highway at the moment is obsolete now, but going underground makes a better view, landscape, and if that highway goes underground, you can see the actual bridge, and people say that many people will come and see this bridge, but the foreigners as well, because maybe if we have a big wooden bridge over the highway, that would be much more attracting people. But from the viewpoint of architect, it may be an enormous new ideas. If you are too serious, I think there is only one way of doing and solving this, going underground or not. But that may be a different alternative coming up from the images. Maybe an architect may not come up with that idea of wooden bridge over the highway.
It's very difficult now to bring together all these things. I forgot to take notes, but and I probably don't remember who brought up which topic. I'll try to synthesize. Starting now from the end, I think that the role you attribute to art, and it is very visible, and maybe probably what you try to describe with ignorance, that is again an operation you do in order to to question a term, or the what we understand as ignorance, is extremely important for art, but also for architecture. And this at some point came up. We play a bit with this, and this is where desire and also the question of the limits of control, are central. So architecture is a cultural discipline. It's not about problem solving. It's not about engineering. So often, the real contribution, and this is probably what the flight assembly architecture is also doing. Being sort of questioning also the role of these grand plans, by, just putting these things at the same level, the technological realization of it, as well as this techno-naive, orgy of plans, of technical drawings that suggest that this thing is feasible, though it's clearly not feasible. I think that our work, and probably what we are interested in, is is a broader, deeply humanistic agenda. So not techno-naive agenda, but a humanistic agenda that includes technology. And this is where, for us, the digital is in no contradiction with architecture. The digital is just a tool or a material. Sometimes we think it is as a material. It has the same right as the physical material that as architects we can work with, to be surprised at a certain point, to question things, and also the notion of desire is inscribed in there. If you would know what's there at the end of a design process, this would be very boring. This is just service providing, what is also right, probably is not what the world needs. And there, of course, it can be questioned. Sometimes we question it ourselves, if this agenda is not neo-romantic or naive, But we think that, these things mix together. We often talk about this figure of the digital craftsman. Digital craftsman, that is something in between a designer and a craftsman. It's post-industrial because it's somebody that owns his tools again. The tools have become smaller again and more versatile and available. It's highly complex, so you need skills. Then this is another parallel to craftsmanship. You are allowed and asked to develop and redevelop continuously your tools to make them personal to you. And this is a different sort of vision than where we come from. Where we talk about alienation of labor, where you don't know what you're doing in a long chain of things, you don't identify with this. Now this can be naive and romantic, but we think that it has a direction, it's a good, gives it a good sort of goal, Although we should not look back, we should radically look forward, but there are certain things that are changing. Yeah. Now probably I only addressed half of the very interesting question that were raised, but.
And I would like to explain to the audience. In Japan, architecture is actually part of engineering, but outside of Japan, the architectural department is the architectural department. It's a discipline in of itself. It's not part of engineering like in Japan. So I studied in Canada. We studied philosophy, we studied social studies, and we looked at how to design the environment, for example. So I think from the Japanese perspective, you may think that Michael and Fabio are very strange architects, but actually thinking of these very complex topics is a part of the architectural discipline. So engineering is normally a completely different faculty. Yes. So architects cannot do the structural calculations. That's the legal system outside of Japan. So perhaps what you're doing may be close to Aida-san more than you think.
Because it's true, this educational system in Switzerland, for example, are separated, but this is not good either. I truly believe that structural engineering and architecture should be the same education. I criticize the philosophy behind the teaching of engineering, because it's often not creative. It just gives me a problem and I deliver you a solution without questioning the question. And this is where we are more trained, because of our, of the tradition of architecture. But it would be good if these two disciplines would come closer together, but with an attitude, that is broader, so questioning the problem and proposing solutions that are non-evident and maybe non-rational at the first sight.
In ETH in Switzerland, digital fabrication, robot arms are used, but at the same time, there's a lot of historical materials, right? Like the CM, congressional bodies, or there's a very big library of the historical architecture. So I think at its base, there's a very conservative, very historic nature as well, and the cutting-edge nature. And I think that we are behind in both. But I think this is also the reason for the strength of the Switzerland design and architecture. I think most of the discussion was focused on architecture up to now. But let's turn our eyes to cities. So, Aida-san, how can you incorporate what we have discussed in your future works? Maybe you have some ideas. Maybe that's too difficult of a question. I'm not sure. So, what is the urban planning, city planning in Japan? I think it was shown in the previous presentation from Igarashi-san that community design seems to be the pure focus of architecture these days. And I have been engaged in community design as well. But this may be unique to Japan, but I think it is drawing near its limits, and similar ideas are always coming up. And I don't think a stable society can be created just by community design. And because it's an urban planning, city planning, of course you have to talk to the authorities. And at the time, with the political situation being so unstable, we can't really work with the lawmakers to create any stable plan. Maybe that was the case for the National Stadium. But once you decide on something, it is usually rejected or changed by the politicians. So I don't think the next phase for architects is clearly visible at this time. And that's one of my headaches. So are there any comments or ideas on how today's discussion can relate to the future of cities? Maybe I'm repeating myself, but architecture and cities, I think it's a continuum. So when you study architecture, you also cities, and if you study cities, you also study architecture. So there's no clear division. So I'm sure that what architects are thinking can be applied to cities. For example, Michal, from me it looks a very religious architecture, but abstractly using numbers, geometric construction can be created, and that's not just for the physical objects, but for buildings and for cities as well. And I think that can be the scale is different, the size is different, but the fundamental relationship between object to object is similar, whether it relates to architecture or city building. I think that is what Michal is thinking. So the relationship between bricks to bricks, or houses to houses, or cities to cities, maybe that's how, at least that's how I interpret their thoughts. So rather than intentionally making this complex by dividing the two, I think it's more about the relationship.
I think we can indeed find many parallels. I think it's in the computer. What we're really doing is building up or looking at relationships between entities, whether it's these small surfaces that are being divided, or whether it's more complex entities in urban planning. In my work, there's very little functional aspect to it, but in urban planning, of course, many different functional parameters come together, many different desires of the future inhabitants come together. There are examples where this algorithmic processes have been used for urban planning in a participatory way. There's a project called Kaisersroth by Kees Christianse, which is a city of 50,000 people where that was realized in the Netherlands, where the future inhabitants could choose what kind of preferences they have. Would they like to live close to a big street or a subway station, or closer to a park, or perhaps close to a church? How important is sunlight to them? How important is proximity to a school? And the computer would rearrange all of the individual buildings to optimize the wishes of the inhabitants. So there are definitely parallels, I think.
Yes, so like including education and training. For example, when you talk about architect, I think there are so many answers to it. You have the design, you have the size, and you have to go into detail with the numbers. That's too far, I think. For example, when you talk about scale and entities, when you don't make any limit, with some room for freedom. I think in Japan it is difficult for the architects to have that room and enjoy that room. I think, especially I was educated in Japan and US. I think in the first session today, Corbusier's urban planning, I think I don't want to respect this, but I think people say that modern architect is correct if you start from Corbusier. So we don't seek that. I think ambiguity is more important, and then we can create new value out of it. And in dealing that, we need a platform, and one of them is digital platform, and that's very powerful. And I think we need to have interdisciplinary platform so that we can use various things in an ambiguity environment. Toyoda-san? I have a question to you, Toyoda-san. Aida-san talked about urban planning, and Aida-san mentioned weed. And he said we should center on weed-like things. From Toyoda-san, what is the weed-like thing for you? Well, what do you mean by that? Weed? I'm sorry. You mentioned ambiguity. In ambiguity, do you think weed can exist in that ambiguity? Weed-like thing, I think, is ambiguity. And what is generated from that? Aida-san, can you also elaborate? Well, maybe there are many people in urban planning that is insisting as follows. It may be your preference, but slum and barracks and post-war houses, people just get their materials by themselves and build the houses by themselves, and there are barracks and slums being created after the war. So idealistically, I prefer such a thing. If a slum is more comfortable to live, then I would like to live. That is second floorism that I propose. So from the land, the weed grow just freely. So you mentioned about a natural thing is that you don't have a same height of trees. So natural in nature, you have different heights of trees and plants when built. So that Corbusier-like grand design and building that is decided by a designer and from up and that is ordered to build, that's one end, I think, an extreme. But on the other extreme, we have the weed. But using computer, maybe something different might come up. It is circulating, so to speak. This is amateur and architect listening to the ideas. I've just come up with that words. Yes, computational designing. I think they're studying on slums, how to design a better slums. I think many people are studying on that. Maybe I've guessed so. I thought so. But maybe there are people studying on pensions. So maybe I thought that people would study slums. Yes, I had selected slum for my graduate theme. At that time, I did not have computer, but I had made the designing. But as a result, I found the tool of computer. So weed, whether I like weed or not, yes, I have a lot of weed. Controlled landscape is not my preference. But if you just let it by itself, it is too dirty. So metabolism, control it well, but not a perfect way. But I like that methodology. That may be urban-like, maybe city, maybe non-decisive, but designed. That's the landscape that I prefer, I like. So ambiguity. From philosophical viewpoint, can you give an idea? Yes, I think something that is not controlled by the human beings. I think in the study group you mentioned about hyper-object. Maybe it's difficult for you to link your philosophy to it. Yes, I think to what in today's context, I don't know how my philosophy could be linked to today's context, but I dare to say that fragility or something that could be collapsed. And in this regard, the world is made up of fragile things, I think, and to this we have to make a form. And maybe one way of thinking is starting from weeds. That means that Aiba-san mentioned sponge-like things. Maybe this is a unique thing in Japan. In the local communities, we have depopulated areas so much. Can you explain on that? That means we have so many holes or unused spaces everywhere. So the land has been just got rid of. People got rid of the land, and there are unused lands. Is it very unique in Japan, or can we see it in around the world? We have depopulated areas, so many senior people, and declining population. So the city itself is becoming smaller. How can you comment on this? Maybe.
Say I'm not an urban designer, so I'm perfectly ignorant in this subject matter. Maybe this is also the reason why we did a statement from the exterior with flight assembled architecture about these things that allows us to be ironic, to question, to be critical. Now, from what I observe, saying I'm not knowledgeable, but from what I observe, I recognize that 95% of the discussion about, let's say, what we call smart city, and this is interesting because it's also a subject here, is at the end of the day just a techno-naive second phase of modernism, with other tools. Because the belief that you can by analyzing things with digital whatever computational means, control everything and predict and make things smart, probably without really understanding what smart means, for me is deceiving. And this is the 95%, and this is for me, engineering grand plans that sound very nice, but they will collapse the same way as the modern city idea collapsed at a certain point. What I think is more interesting is to probably revisit, for example, metabolisms, as concepts that were somewhere in between, that got also lost, that were not, they were in between things, because as already the term says, this is much more complex, an organism, and there is where I, as an ignorant, think the city or the mega city or the global city is closer, and this is the thing where this beyond control, that is more about, working with flexibility, with the ability to adapt at some point, knowing that we don't know is the only technique to go on. This is a bit, and I could sort of relate with the work we do, but it's another, I'm aware that it's another science, from the knowledge behind. Sorry. Sure.
Okay, so I'm back myself. It's working? Okay. Okay, so 1 micro is enough. Thank you. Thank you. Now, okay, I am also in the show. It's okay, it doesn't matter. Don't you think that the expertise, traditionally, historically, the expertise of tooling, of science, now we could talk about AI, of technology, has been all the time reinforcing the structures on the organization of power, on its privilege. So it's a kind of a DNA of architect using science. And it was initially in Europe an extremely strong debate on the metabolism after the war. Not exactly on the same styles on Isozaki in Japan, on the Bay of Tokyo, and very different. The metabolism of Constant, of Friedman, of Emmerich coming as a survivor, as a surviving guy from the Nazi camp, from the horror of the barbaria of the Second War, was to invent a democratic, an architecture without architect, to scratch the figure, the magister, the deus ex machina, this authority of top-down of the architect, and to free a degree of loophole, to produce a superstructures which is able to be colonized, post-colonized, transformed, corrupted, perturbed by the desire, by the multitude, in the sense of Negri, in the sense of Antonio Negri, the philosopher of the multitude with Michael Hart, in a way to accept this energy of the mass. The danger I see since this last 20 years of digital, we are more and more becoming the expertise for the massive elite, by the massive elite. More and more, 80% of the students in your school, in my school, are coming from wealthy family, which never want to scratch the organization of power. They want to reproduce by education the system which perpetuates the system of value. So education, digital, exhibition, museum are doing now a kind of layering of value about technology, which is ignoring the revolt, which is ignoring the catastrophe of economy of the citizen. Everywhere in the world, don't speak about Japan, the impoverishment of the situation. So could we democratize? I want to speak also about the fact that architect is a notion which is coming from Renaissance period. The church in France, which has been burned, and everybody saw that, there was no architect. There was a swarm, extremely swarm, intelligences of craftsmen. So the multitude of knowledge is able to produce an extreme degree of risk or degree of innovation. We don't need this top-down with technology. At the opposite, could we use algorithms? Could we use the sophistication of the way that we are able to script? And we could script something in conflict, coming from different input, and by the way, reveal the misunderstanding, the mishearing, the complexity, and absorb the multitude of contradictory desire. It's not innocent that here I'm showing something of 2009, just at the time of Lehman Brothers crisis. After Lehman Brothers crisis, which touched all the world, the niche of research disappeared. The niche of research to include biopolitics, to question social organization, to question the way that we are living together, not only the fantasy to make, as many of us are talented, the fantasy to do the extreme research as a mirror of ourselves. So my question is simple. Do you think we could scratch this predicted or predictable situation where we work for the rich, by the rich, through the money of the rich, for a kind of layer of generations, which layer of society, which never talk about bottom-up.
So I think the comment was that architects are giving more power to the rich and powerful, but technology could be for the mass, for a more democratic direction. And in the workshop, we did discuss such a democratization aspect of technology. Perhaps somebody could pitch in. So weed and science, I think I am the only scientist in this panel. So I'm not talking on behalf of the scientists, but let me pitch in. So technology and science are wheels on the same car, and providing common ground to different science, and there is also a trespassing aspect. So innovation should be created from science. For example, we talked about architecture and urban planning and concepts like weeds and ecology from a broader perspective were discussed. But in terms of discipline, what is being discussed in the field of ecology, I think it's like a parallel world. What we're discussing today is not discussed in the discipline of ecology. It's not that there is a limit to the technology and that is not possible. For example, the algorithmic simulations and the autonomous modeling is being done in the field of ecology. And the models in ecology are utilized. The same algorithm is used for the energy efficiency. But the people who are designing and implementing do not have sufficient literacy in that field. So, of course, theories should be studied on both sides. But taking inspiration from the weed discussion, we need the soil for the weeds to grow. I am involved in the 2020 biodiversity guideline for SAO. And the reason why we need a rich soil is we talk about greening or controlling the emission of CO2. But those are actually the leaves and the branches of the tree. When there is a biodiversity from the greening, what happens is the very rich soil with multiple functions. It's not simply that we need to increase the number of trees. We need to have the soil and the underground water that can develop these forests. And this is a field that traditional science has already been studying for hundreds of years, and there is already a common ground. But when we talk about metabolism, we don't talk about the green urbanization, looking at the soil. And if we green for example, the Metropolitan government building, it should be like a watershed, and so there needs to be a river. But actually, that kind of discussion is not happening. So the expertise that have been accumulated in traditional science is not digitalized or shared across disciplines. And I don't think So Mihao, you said that what you created is not to the level of intricacy of the butterfly, and I think that was very symbolic. The complexity of the human architecture and the design of the butterfly, we are at least able to compare the two. So I believe the sustainability of cities will expand by applying the base science that is already out there. And I think that will create common ground for mutual discussion. Thank you very much. So, from Funabashi-san's comments, the metabolism of city and architecture, I don't think we have been entirely successful in that rejuvenation. And I think these are issues that cannot be resolved just in the discipline of architecture. So there needs to be more interdiscipline discussion and then reintegration of these diverse ideas. And if there's a new metabolism architecture, then I think that can only be enabled by a multidisciplinary approach. There were so many types of comments and opinions, so it's very difficult for me to wrap up. But I think the difficulty in summarizing this discussion is actually symbolic of the multi-directional approach that we should be seeking. Thank you very much.